What if being yourself is exactly what bothers people the most? Not your arrogance, not your lack of tact, not your mistakes, but your honesty, your calm presence, your ability to stay grounded without raising your voice. What if your kindness, instead of bringing people together, triggers resentment? What if your light doesn't just shine, it exposes the shadows in the people around you? There's a quiet discomfort that hangs in the air when someone doesn't fit the unspoken rules. You might have been respectful, generous, even overly considerate. And still, something about you stirs rejection. You don't know why, but you feel it, in the eyes that avoid yours, in the words that sting without cause, in the coldness that seems to come out of nowhere. You start to wonder what you're doing wrong. But deep down, you know that's not it. It's not about what you do. It's about what you represent. Some people don't dislike you for what you say, they're unsettled by how you exist. Your presence confronts them with parts of themselves they've worked hard to ignore. They're threatened by your calm because they secretly crave it. They feel exposed by your honesty because they've learned to survive by lying to themselves. They feel anger toward your gentleness because they've relied on hardness to feel safe. And when someone like you shows up, kind, but strong, clear, without being aggressive, their inner structure starts to shake. Not because you've attacked them, but because you refuse to play the same game. There's something deeply unsettling about encountering someone who doesn't need to dominate to be powerful. Who doesn't compete because they've already made peace with who they are. And that peace is intolerable to someone at war with themselves. Not everyone can handle harmony. Not everyone knows what to do with someone who doesn't explain themselves, who doesn't shrink to be liked, who doesn't ask for permission to exist. They'll say you're too sensitive, that you're overreacting, that you're imagining things. But you know how to read what isn't said. You pick up on gestures, on silences filled with quiet poison, on smiles that mask judgment. And no matter how many times you try to soften yourself, to fit in, to dim your light, there will always be someone who finds your authenticity unbearable. Because you're not following the script. You're not playing the same theater. And that's when the hatred shows up. Not loud or obvious, but subtle, quiet, disguised. It doesn't always look like yelling or insults. Sometimes it's distance for no reason, or constant criticism that always seems to come with the but. Sometimes it's hidden in advice that sounds caring but cuts deep, or in little jokes meant to belittle you, all while smiling. It feels personal, but it's not. It feels like your fault, but it isn't. It's psychological. It's deep. And most of all, it's unconscious. Jung said it with a clarity that still echoes in anyone brave enough to look within. When someone refuses to face their own shadow, they project it. And without even trying, you become the screen. You become the target for everything they can't admit to themselves. The mirror they never asked for. And in that mirror, they don't see your goodness. They see their envy. They don't see your honesty. They see the lies they've told themselves. They don't see your calm. They see their own anxiety. You show up with clarity, and they can't help but notice everything they've buried under layers of denial, convenience, and fake strength. That's why they reject you. That's why they attack. Because they can't attack themselves. The hardest part is that you're trying to be kind. You're trying to build bridges, not walls. But every time you reach out, something cracks inside them. You don't understand it fully, because your intentions are good. But to them, your presence feels like a threat, not an external one, but an internal crack. Every gesture reminds them of what they've lost, of what they want back but are too afraid to reclaim. And then you realize, it's not about changing. It's not about trying harder to be liked. It's not about making yourself smaller so you'll be accepted. There's nothing you can do to avoid rejection from people who haven't learned to accept themselves. Because if you try, you'll lose yourself. And that would be even more unfair. Kindness, when it comes from inner strength and not fear, is an act of courage. It's not weakness. It's not naivete. It's a way of holding your ground without playing the game of emotional violence. But it's also a kind of exposure, because it reveals who you are. And authenticity will always make the ones hiding from themselves uncomfortable. They might never say it. They might never admit it. But that coldness you feel, that subtle contempt, that quiet pushback, It's not really about you. It's about what you stir up in them. About what you awaken without meaning to. You become the catalyst for battles that were never yours. And just by being at peace, you become the enemy of those at war with their own reflection. Some will hate you for not being like them. Others will hate you for being exactly what they wish they could be. Either way, it comes from the same wound. The same shadow you unknowingly shine a light on. And you, who only wanted peace, end up being the target of someone else's unresolved war. So what do? Do you hide? Do you dim your light to make others more comfortable? Do you reshape yourself into someone easier to swallow? Or do you learn to hold your light even when it burns someone else's eyes? No one ever teaches you that being yourself can come at a cost. That being kind doesn't guarantee kindness in return. That being honest doesn't always earn respect. That your clarity might make others deeply uncomfortable. But here's the truth underneath it all. The rejection you face is sometimes the clearest sign that you've outgrown the game. That you can't play along anymore without betraying yourself. That you've evolved. And in a world addicted to appearances, that's revolutionary. That's why it hurts. Because you're walking a different path. Because you can't stay quiet about what you see. Because you can't pretend to be what you're not. And even when you try to keep it light, you can't fit in without falling apart. But you're not alone. And you're not crazy. What you feel makes sense. What you see is real, even if others can't see it yet. And even if your kindness unsettles people, don't put it away. It's not weakness. It's your quiet rebellion. It's your way of staying true to yourself in a world that doesn't always know how to handle truth. You felt that tension even if you didn't have the words for it. That feeling of walking on invisible ground, where any step might upset someone, without any real reason. You've noticed how some people get uncomfortable the moment you walk into the room, even before you say a word. How a simple act of kindness, a sincere sentence, somehow feels threatening to those who've never known inner peace. And you ask yourself, why? Why when you're doing the right thing? Why when you're not attacking, not hurting, not hiding anything? Why does living with your heart open sometimes feel like the most dangerous thing you could ever do? The answer has nothing to do with what you do, and everything to do with what you awaken. Some people have built their lives wearing armor. They've survived through coldness, made numbness a kind of safety. They've learned to earn love by performing, by meeting conditions. And then you show up, without demands. You don't compete. You don't manipulate. You're just there. And your presence alone is proof that another way of living exists. One that's more honest, more human, more free. That's unsettling. That's disruptive. And to many, that's terrifying. Jung once said, what we reject in ourselves doesn't disappear. It just sinks into the unconscious, gaining strength, waiting for a moment to break through. And when someone like you shows up, soft, steady, clear, you become a mirror. Without meaning to, you reflect everything they've spent years hiding. It's not your fault that the reflection hurts them. But that doesn't mean you can stop it from happening. Some people would rather hate you than ask themselves difficult questions. They'd rather push you away than reconsider how they connect to the world. They need to believe your peace is fake, that your kindness is just another mask, that your silence is some kind of superiority. Because if they admitted you were real, if they let themselves believe that people can live differently, more consciously, they'd have to face the fact that they could too, but aren't. And that truth is unbearable for some. That's where the resentment starts. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your way of being threatens theirs. Your calm rattles their chaos. Your steadiness reminds them of everything they've abandoned. You don't provoke, you resonate. You don't force or intrude or demand, but you resonate. And that frequency, so different from their own, feels strange. Sometimes even violent. Not because it is, but because they've forgotten how to recognize what's real. Maybe as a child, you were taught that kindness was the right way to exist. That giving without expecting was a form of strength. That holding your truth with gentleness was integrity, not weakness. But as you grew up, you learned something else. Not everyone sees it that way. Some see your warmth as a threat. Some mistake your grace for arrogance, because they've only ever known obedience as kindness. So you doubted yourself. You questioned your tone. You softened your words even more. You even stayed quiet. But it was never enough. Because the problem was never your approach. It was your essence. You blamed yourself. As if just being who you are was somehow too much. As if you needed to apologize for stirring emotions you didn't cause and barely understood. But at some point, maybe in silence, maybe alone, you finally saw it clearly. You can't carry the weight of other people's unresolved conflicts. You can't dim your light just so others don't feel overshadowed. You can't pretend not to see, just to avoid making others uncomfortable. That would be a slow form of betrayal. That was when you started to reclaim your dignity. Not with a shout. Not with some loud rebellion. But by coming home to yourself. You realized your kindness isn't a favor. It's a choice. Your calm isn't passivity, it's clarity. Your presence, when it's unfiltered, might bother some, but it can also heal. Though healing, as you know, requires pain to surface. And not everyone is willing to go through that. Rejection that shows up without clear reason isn't always a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes, it's a sign you're finally walking your own path. That you're stepping outside the unspoken system where hypocrisy is rewarded and emotional honesty is punished. That you can no longer play the game without losing parts of yourself. It's not easy to stand your ground. Sometimes the loneliness stings. Sometimes the silence from others is louder than any noise. But it becomes clearer who actually sees you, and who only sees what they project onto you. Who stays because they resonate with you, and who stays because they want something from you. Who needs you to shrink so they can feel safe, and who accepts you fully without conditions. That's when the soul starts doing its own kind of sorting. That's when you start choosing connection based on truth, not performance. What Jung left us isn't a set of easy answers. It's a map for navigating the unseen. The shadow isn't the enemy. It's the part of the psyche that's gone unacknowledged. But when someone refuses to face it, they'll project it onto the person who has the courage to live awake. Without knowing it, you become the surface where their buried pain appears. And if you don't realize that, you might start confusing their hatred with your own guilt. But once you do see it for what it is, you're free. And in that quiet freedom, even as people glance at you with suspicion or discomfort, you keep growing. Even if they never admit it, something in you touches something in them. Something they've forgotten. Something they've buried. And that discomfort they mask as dislike? Sometimes it's just fear. Fear of change. Fear of remembering who they were before they forgot. Fear of someone showing them, without saying a word, that there's another way to exist. So even if it hurts, don't stop being you. Even if it makes people uncomfortable, even if no one claps, even if they leave. The real stuff, authenticity, presence, emotional honesty, rarely gets recognized right away. The world doesn't always celebrate what's true. But with time, the ones who are waking up will find you. And then you won't need to explain your peace. You won't need to justify your gentleness. You won't need to hide your truth just to belong. Because by then, you'll know, there are kinds of rejection that don't diminish you. There are kinds of hate that don't belong to you. And sometimes, just sometimes, being who you are is exactly what you came here to do. Even if it unsettles them. Even if it breaks the script. Even if not everyone's ready. And then it hits you. Not all at once. Not with perfect clarity. But just enough to make you stop carrying questions that only ever led you in circles. You realize it was never about changing who you are to avoid being judged. Never about toughening up just so it wouldn't hurt. It was never about hiding your softness or muting your perception just to blend into a world that's terrified of its own reflection. It was always about learning how to walk through life carrying all of it, your depth, your wounds, your sensitivity, with clear eyes. Without turning your pain into armor or your fear into a mask. And you realize you're not alone, even though it's felt that way for a long time. There are others, maybe still silent, maybe still waking up, who felt the same sting of rejection, the same discomfort mirrored back at them for simply showing up as their real selves. Others who've been called too much, just because they refuse to be less. Who've been misunderstood, dismissed, or criticized by people who couldn't tolerate in them what they've long since buried in themselves. And in that realization, something shifts. Not into resentment, not into pain, but into dignity. Into a quiet clarity that tells you, You're not here to adjust to what hurts, you're here to remember what heals. Because there's a kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, that doesn't push, doesn't seek to prove. It's the strength of someone who's been wounded but hasn't lost their softness. Someone who's been discarded but never learned to discard. Someone who's been misread and still chooses to speak clearly, not to be understood, but to stay loyal to their truth. And that strength, your strength, isn't measured by how many people clap for you or how well you fit in. It's measured by your ability to keep being you, even when being you is the thing that's hurt the most. There will come a time, maybe it's already come, when you stop waiting for other people to change so you can finally feel safe. When you stop needing to convince anyone of your goodness. When you stop defending your way of being. You'll just be. Not as some act of rebellion, but as a quiet decision to exist. You'll show up, calm, deep, honest. And yeah, some people will still feel uneasy around that. Some will still project their own shadows onto you. But it won't hurt the same way anymore. Because you'll finally understand that the real pain wasn't what they did, it was that, back then, you still didn't know who you were inside all of it. But now you do. Now, you no longer get lost in mixed signals or poisoned words. You've stopped chasing meaning in every reaction because now you know. People's reactions aren't always about you. A lot of the time, when someone rejects you, they're rejecting themselves, through you. When someone hates you without reason, they're not really looking at you. They're seeing their own face and trying not to recognize it. And it's not your job to rescue them from that. Your only job is to not let their reflection rewrite your truth. With time, you even start to feel grateful for what hurt you. Because it taught you to see clearly. To choose carefully who gets access to your space, your energy, your vulnerability. You stopped explaining yourself to people who didn't want to understand. And you started saving your tenderness for those brave enough to face their own shadows too. You became more selective, yes, but not out of arrogance. Out of self-respect. Out of love. Because you finally understood that not every environment can hold what you are. And that doesn't make you better. Just more aware of what you need. Those boundaries, the ones that once felt like defense mechanisms, now become the frame that protects your authenticity. The quiet border that allows you to keep being yourself without shattering. The space where you can hold your sensitivity without apologizing for it. Because now you know. Your kindness is not weakness. Your empathy is not naivety. Your silence is not surrender. It's choice. It's power, held gently. It's wisdom, earned. There's something profoundly freeing about no longer asking for permission to exist. About no longer trying to convince people who've already decided not to listen. About no longer explaining your light to those who've only ever lived in shadows. When you stop doing that, when you decide to just be without needing approval, something shifts inside. You stop feeling exposed for being different. You start feeling free. You stop bending to be liked and start surrounding yourself with people who see beyond the performance. And in that quiet turning, something sacred begins. A sense of belonging, not the kind that comes from a group, but the kind that rises from your soul. Sure, there'll still be moments of discomfort. It'll still sting sometimes, realizing there are people who'd rather hate you than open up to you. But that sadness stops feeling like a life sentence. It becomes a reminder that you chose a different path. One where worth isn't measured by how many people accept you, but by how true you are to yourself. Where success isn't about being liked by everyone, but about never betraying your core for anyone. Where real victory isn't about fitting in, but about standing your ground even when everything around you tries to break it. And when you reach that place, even in the middle of rejection, you feel peace. Not the kind of peace that depends on silence from others, but the kind that can't be shaken. The kind that comes from knowing you don't have to pretend to be valuable. That you don't need to be understood to be whole. That you don't have to belong to what wounds you just to avoid feeling alone. That's when everything changes. Because you stop seeing hatred as a threat, and start seeing it as a sign. A sign that who you are reaches deeper than most are ready for. That, without even meaning to, you're showing a path others haven't dared to walk. And not everyone will be ready to see it. But you are. And that's enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to hold your ground. Enough to stay lit, even when it burns. Enough to walk with your soul wide open, even when the world shuts its eyes. Because in the end, you weren't made to be comfortable. You were made to be real.